I'm so sorry, you've caught me staring at my own reflection. Welcome back to Zero Books and Repeater Media, and today we are talking about narcissism. We're discussing new book, NIB, Narcissism in Bloom, with the author, one Maddie Colquhoun. Maddie, welcome back to the show.
Hi, yeah, nice to see you all again. It's been a while.
So, that thing I was just doing, why do people think it's so bad?
Checking yourself before you wreck yourself is a good starting point for any public facing activity, I think. Why is it so bad? I guess it's not. Buy my book. Okay, see you all next time.
Sorry, completely. I'm not on much blood sugar today, but there we go. So, who was Narcissus, and what is the kind of pathology or syndrome or way of expressing a self-relation that now bears his name?
I guess it's a complicated history, really. I guess, yeah, we know of narcissism as this kind of generalized pathology that we apply to just about everybody who may take the time to consider themselves arguably a bit too closely. But yeah, it's not that simple. And I guess that was the starting point for this book. Narcissus, the man of Greek mythology, there are multiple different versions of the tale. I guess there's two main ones. The one that's more popularly known is Narcissus is a solitary hunter wandering through the woods. He hears what sounds like his own voice from the nymph Echo, who has no voice of her own, follows it and comes across a spring upon which he sees himself for the first time. And there is one version of the tale that everybody seems to know, which is that he falls in love with it and is so infatuated he falls into his reflection and drowns. But the classic telling of the tale, written by the Roman poet Ovid, has a very different ending, where Narcissus is tormented by this reflection that he sees but cannot possess, and instead decides to transform himself, or tears himself apart and is transformed into a daffodil. And yeah, we don't seem to think about or even know about that version of the tale. And I think it gives us a very different reading of what narcissism is or could be, and how we could maybe use it slightly differently in our sort of day-to-day conversations about ourselves.
The aspect of as a transformative nihilism, I think, is really sort of the driving and sort of the most blooming, in a way, thesis of this book. And I guess I kind of take us back to some of the more contemporary examples, because the subtitle of this work is An Alternative History of the Selfie, and particularly the selfie as the object of a very conservative, sometimes very conservative leftist. I'm thinking of people like, for example, Christopher Lasch, sort of looking down on narcissism as essentially and only ever pathological. But I guess I wanted to ask one of the examples from which you sort of really start the book off in terms of thinking about this transformative narcissism, this idea almost of seizing the means of self-representation. And that's through the example you give earlier of a selfie, I think it might be 2011, I think, from put together by Britney Spears and Paris Hilton, particularly their claim to have invented the selfie and the backlash around this, which leads you into thinking, well, actually, no, they are presenting themselves in a way, the selfie, in a transformed manner. I wonder if you can unpack that a little bit. Yeah,
I guess the subtitle of the book, An Alternative History of the Selfie, was kind of plucked out of thin air. I'm not still, it's out now, so there's no changing it, but I'm not sure if I'm entirely happy with it, because I think it's so much more than that, and the selfie is kind of a vehicle for investigating this convoluted relationship we have to the self. But yeah, the Hilton Spears selfie is kind of an interesting example, I think, because at some point Paris Hilton tweeted this selfie of her and Britney Spears and said it was when they invented the selfie, and everyone denounced this as a sort of anachronism. But there's some weight to it, I think, because it's kind of this moment where, I guess, sort of maybe just prior to the dawn of social media, where you have two of the most photographed women of the 2000s, whose kind of lives are well, at least more recently, are defined by a kind of lack of autonomy over how they are presented. Or, I mean, even that's not so simple. Britney Spears, I guess, is sort of framed as this person who, had very little control, a kind of traumatic lack of control over how she was perceived. She even sang about it on her song "Piece of Me," and then very infamously had a sort of mental breakdown over sort of being tormented by paparazzi. Paris Hilton's slightly different. There's an interesting documentary about Paris Hilton that came out a few years ago, where she actually presents this kind of airhead, heiress persona as precisely that, as kind of an invention. And she's someone that actually has a far more complicated sort of personal life than we're sort of led to believe. Is far more kind of has a far more conscious sort of approach to how she is perceived by the world around her, as if this sort of fake self is a buffer that allows her to keep some sort of privacy. And the way that she is sort of dismissed as being an airhead allows her to actually just get on with being sort of a bit of a girl boss businesswoman behind the scenes. And it kind of, it sort of shows that this Selfie is a bit of a, I think so anyway, a bit of a kind of watershed moment in this new age of celebrity, which I guess then is sort of extended to everybody else in the age of social media, where we have a far more there's kind of a Baudrillard quote, I think, at some point, where he talks about celebrities as kind of being like the anti-individuals. They sort of frame themselves as individuals, sort of par excellence, but actually, they're kind of enemies of individuality. And I think that sort of following the invention of social media, that thesis kind of gets inverted a bit. And there is this striving, I think, for I guess positioning yourself as an individual of a certain type, but how that's sort of a vehicle to become other things. And maybe we deride that the potentials that are kind of innate to social media's sort of the changes that's brought about within our lives. They're not all negative, I suppose. There is this kind of changing of how we see ourselves that could be more productive, I think. But there's this sort of moralizing tendency that forecloses whatever possibilities might be sort of there within how new technologies allow us to change our sense of self or present different senses of self.
Absolutely. I mean, particularly on the case of social media, I mean, what we put out there, what we translate into data, into posts, eventually does tend to feed back for the other side of the screen. And this is something I've been working on at the moment recently. This is kind of the German idealist vision of autonomy. You translate, you estrange yourself, and then in the manner of your self-estrangement, into like a more universal kind of media, literally mediation, as Hegel loves to put it. You then return to yourself in a way in which your immediate way in which you determine yourself goes away and then comes back to determine you. You play a part in determining that which determines you. And of course, there's still this the capitalist real in the way, But I think this is a really fantastic way of describing us. I think there's another point you make as well about social movements and the criticism that's leveled against them on the level of narcissism. And I think this could be a really good point to explain, actually, before we go into some more of the stuff about the media itself, particularly with photography and the like. Just hitting on this idea of narcissism as a conservative critique, and also showing how narcissism, in response to that critique, is more about becoming a self than it is being one.
Yeah, it's a really telling development, I think, where narcissism, I guess, is as a kind of pathology that's sort of birthed by early psychoanalysis to, pathologize self-concern, essentially, very much at the level of the individual. There's this sort of shift more recently where people start talking about things like collective narcissism, which I guess is something of a contradiction. I don't know how can what is this sense of a collective narcissism when narcissism is sort of this individualized pathology, and it's I think considering in that way it seems to be full of holes. But I came across this in terms of predominantly people talking about the Black Lives Matter movement on the one hand, but I guess all kinds of different I guess not just social justice movements, but also we could maybe provocatively call social injustice movements, the kind of like reactions to things like Black Lives Matter, like All Lives Matter or White Lives Matter. And there's this research group that are strangely based at Goldsmiths, known for, I guess, being a bit more of a very progressive, politically so institution. There's this research group there that focuses specifically on the dynamics of intergroup conflicts and things like this. And they talk about, I guess, not yet groups like movements like Black Lives Matter, but also sort of nationalities, religious groups. Everything's kind of brought under this heading of collective narcissism. So, for example, complaints by people of the Islamic faith about representations of Muhammad, for instance, that's used an example of one group seeing itself as having a kind of privileges in certain kinds of representation, or it could be like English nationalists having a kind of inflated sense of self. But again, also Black Lives Matter. So it becomes this very very promiscuous term for denouncing just about any kind of, well, I think fundamentally sense of intergroup solidarity, for better or for worse. And that promiscuity of the application of a phrase like collective narcissism is again just inherently problematic. It doesn't really do anything. And there's there's a bit in the introduction to the book where I draw on this blog post by Rod Dreher, of all people, the kind of very evangelical fundamentalist Christian political commentator, who is talking about Black Lives Matter and sort of sees how this term collective narcissism can be applied both to Black communities that are under distress and also those that kind of are critics of the movement. And he, of all people, makes the quite valid point, I think, that maybe this term is just a way of pathologizing away social issues. And if, the conservative right is getting onto this kind of, there's an inherent problem with this kind of thinking, that's surely a sort of cause for concern. Why aren't, more progressive thinkers thinking along these same lines and fleshing out this, I guess, the sort of a critical arsenal for really just getting rid of this whole social tendency that we have across the political spectrum of denouncing people as narcissists. It does nothing.
Couldn't agree more. I mean, it's almost like these conservatives look at us and they think we're saying, look, we're collectively, we're all individuals. And then the fascist shows up and says, in a classic Monty Python bit, I'm not. Anyway, bad jokes aside, Craig, Will, I want to open up the floor here.
Sure. Well, I'm glad you landed on the word promiscuity, because amidst you talking about the selfie, I was thinking of what was going to be my original question, which is in your book, this kind of genealogy of the selfie. But I think more than that, just there's a kind of Gothic materialism at work that runs through, and that I really noticed when we talked about the sort of incipient moment of photography as not only as an invention, but as a kind of pastime emerged in the 19th century. But the idea of promiscuity, I think, is interesting and is somewhat relevant given, for example, the whole Barbenheimer, the Barbenheimer phenomenon, where one of the protests that was made about the sort of memes, the clash of these two films minimized what had happened in Nagasaki and Hiroshima, years and years ago. And I remember, the sort of Japanese populace's, response to that was to create these ironic memes, that showed Barbie with Osama bin Laden. And what was interesting is that the Americans, who this sort of retaliatory salvo was directed at, were not affected by this at all. It's almost as if that they were so grafted into this sort of representational strata where that's great. This is the kind of irony, this is the kind of sadism that we enjoy with the image. And it made me think, and I thought about that amidst reading your book, how the idea of death or a Gothic Marxism or a Gothic materialism kind of reappears at each sort of epoch or stage upon which either photography develops, the iPhone develops, the front-facing camera. You talk about that, especially at the beginning where you talk about daguerreotypes, for example, how in the early days of photography, you had to sit still maybe for 10 minutes or 30 minutes and try not to close your eyes or blink, where blinking became this sort of like problematic activity for taking a picture because it made our eyes look ghostly or spectral. And that connected to the fact that maybe in the latter part of the 19th century, we have the emergence of the spiritualism movement, where folks are taking pictures, to make themselves either appear dead or alongside ghosts. And I forget the name of the figure associated with photography who took one of the very first selfies, which was him sort of drowned in an image with the death, the shroud of death over him. And I was hoping you could talk about that a little bit. Like, what did I miss in your sort of methodology of the Gothic materialism or Gothic Marxism that stretches from the incipient moment of the development of photography? Maybe it even happens before that. I mean, Narcissus himself is a figure who dies within the water. Yeah, that's my question.
Yeah, so I guess maybe it would help to give a little explanation of the structure of the book. I guess what we were talking about before, I guess it's kind of a lot of that's contained in the introduction. But following this challenge to our broader sense of narcissism to suggest how we can think about things differently. I guess the idea is that this doesn't require a completely whole new mode of thinking. We can kind of trace back, if not just the selfie, or I guess it's, if that Hilton Spears claimed that their selfie was the invention of the selfie, but which is challenged, but rather you could say it's at least a kind of adaptation or mutation in terms of how we think about and are representing ourselves. I guess the idea then was to go back to just to give a kind of a potted history of self-representation through art history. And that starts in the Renaissance with the first, or at least when, self-portraiture really takes off. And that's notably, around the time of the Italian Renaissance. And it kind of prefigures a lot of sort of philosophies of the self. The first selfies are taken, the first self-portraits are painted, rather, about 100 years before Descartes' discourse on method. His whole "I think, therefore I am," the self as the first principle of his philosophy. And there's this kind of there's this sort of I guess a Gothic materialist, but I guess even just historical materialist undercurrent there, where political changes at that time, specifically in Italy, give rise to this new sense of the individual. And the printing press helps with that. There's also the rise of Protestantism, and I kind of go through this in the book, but that's, I guess, when this idea of the self or the individual kind of first comes about. It's relatively recent that we've thought about ourselves in that way. But even then, it's kind of seen as this sort of flawed way of thinking about ourselves. These representations of the self are imperfect and incomplete, and artists start to realize that. We'll talk about Rembrandt a bit, who painted so many self-portraits. And his self-portraits, particularly towards the end of his life, he becomes sort of they're more and more kind of objective in a way. It's not really how he's subjectively seeing himself, but he renders himself as kind of this piece of meat. And I guess the second sort of main section of the book, the first on the Italian Renaissance is called Birth, the second is Death, and then that kind of, I guess, unpacks the photography is this kind of radical technological change in self-representation. And I guess it sort of photography forces the quiet part that was kind of there in these initial painterly self-portraits is made so much louder, where this kind of sort of temporal restrictions of photography as capturing a moment rather than kind of being this arduous painted long-term process to sort of produce an image. The instantaneousness of photography makes us all the more aware of how fleeting our self-representations can be. So much photographic theory in particular is very kind of mournful and melancholic. People like Roland Barthes and Susan Sontag have a very kind of quite depressive view of photography, a very pessimistic view. That it's sort of fixated on death, on the way photography makes us aware of our own mortality, the way that we take photographs of people very much alive that then we may hold on to long after their deaths. We kind of never, Susan Sontag calls photography as essentially a way of it's a way of a form of inventory of our own mortality, something like that anyway. And yeah, I guess that it's within this sort of tension, there's this Gothic materialist part, I think, is sort of how when we kind of become more aware of how the sort of inefficacy of representations of the individual, rather than kind of be wholly mournful of that fact, we can kind of maybe see how the individual is not something to rest upon. And we should kind of move into maybe more collective ways of thinking about ourselves. And that is kind of prefigured. I guess I talk a bit about like Marx and Engels and their explicit sort of historical materialism, the way that they talk about Engels in particular talks about the Peasants' War in Germany. So you have, I guess, it's another thing that I guess we forget in terms of the history of individualism, as if individualism is this wholly negative thing that we should do away with. But when individualism, I guess, emerges as a kind of strut of liberal ideology, it's kind of for the better and for the worse. There's Jacob Burckhardt is like this art historian who has a book about the he has a history of the Renaissance, the title of which I can't remember now, but he had developed what's then called the Burckhardt thesis, which is that at that time, sort of mid-millennia, we moved from having sort of despots who have this kind of sovereign idea of their own, like, divine individuality, that they are, determined by God to be supreme individuals who have the right to rule. And there's a kind of like trickle-down individualism that emerges from this. So despots kind of inspire individualism in their sort of noblemen, and then that kind of trickles down until eventually the peasantry also gains a new sense of itself as being, individuals. And that, it kind of comes to a head in terms of the rise of Protestantism, where you have, the emergence of a Protestant work ethic. Your own agency is all that's responsible for your own salvation. First spiritual salvation, and then I guess now economic salvation. But when you realize that that's easier said than done, the rise of individualism in, I guess, like the 1600s, gives rise to a sort of a proto-communist sentiment within Europe. So the sort of rise of Protestantism leads explicitly to the Peasants' War, the first kind of armed uprising of the peasantry against the aristocracy, demanding redistribution of wealth. And that's kind of, I guess, like there's that I kind of in the book talk about how that's kind of the starting point for, I guess, but yeah, both like a communist ways of thinking, but also the sort of it's direct product of individualism. And perhaps all the more so today, we shouldn't forget that fact that your individual sense of self can be the kind of starting point for a new sense of political consciousness. And yeah, when we consider how narcissism is used as this, like, as a pathology to sort of denounce how we think too much about ourselves, I think maybe there's a kind of purposeful restriction of imagination there, as if to say that if we all thought a little bit more about our own predicaments, our own concerns, and how they don't necessarily connect with social norms, we would maybe more easily develop other kinds of sort of collective consciousness. And against what we may think or be told then and now, individualism or a new sense of individual consciousness is kind of the first step onto achieving that new collective consciousness.
Yeah, perhaps just one more thing before I let Will go. When I started the book, I felt very seen at the beginning when you talked about the kind of person who prided themselves in not being online. And prior to starting Acid Horizon, I was kind of one of those people, and I was like, hey, wait a minute. This was kind of my line of flight, or my escape from the madness that is social media and so forth. And it made me, and that kind of stuck with me amidst this thesis that you just talked about, that the emergence of this bourgeois notion of individuality coincides with development of forms of representation and so forth. But I wanted to push back on that slightly and say that is there not something to perhaps maybe it's a latent collective will within my own individual will to kind of run and hide from the selfie, or run and hide from the space we're seeing, and maybe develop something that's either post-subjective or desubjectivated in a sense. Do you see that there's any tendency developing either within the technology or the culture in which, what has been called narcissistic conceals maybe this deeper need to, kind of coalesce with the mass, or, experience a kind of collective ecstasy with one another?
Yeah. I mean, I guess the point of that, a little aside, I think, is that, I think I say something like we kind of denounce people that are kind of open in terms of how they're perceived online by very much posting a lot and sharing images of themselves and their lives. But I guess the point is that we denounce that as a kind of overt sort of self-concern. But precisely people that don't appear online, at least in my experience, I'm talking to friends that are very much offline, they also have a kind of an overt self-concern in how they will appear. So there's that self-concern is apparent whether you're appearing or not. There's fundamentally at basis as concern for self-representation. And that's not to say that I guess it's to say that self-concern is kind of fundamental. This what we call narcissism, or these narcissistic tendencies, it's all the more of a misstep to pathologize them, because they are kind of universal to the human experience. Who does not have some kind of self-concern over who they are and are perceived to be? And that's even beyond sort of talking about social media. I think that's true of just being, a social animal. Even if we're just offline and very much hanging out with our friends, we'll always kind of, I'm sure everybody knows what it's like to have that voice in the back of your head of, did you say the right thing, or that, a kind of social anxiety. But I guess that's kind of this it's fundamental to the human condition in a way. It's something that I guess I talked a bit more about in my first book, Egress, sort of through Bataille, where Bataille talks about this sense of communication being fundamentally wounding. I guess what is meant by what I sort of, I guess, now think about in how I think about that phrase now, is that wounding is kind of can be very much inspirational in a way. I mean, that's the kind of the central problem that narcissism as a pathology represents. If you are, for Freud anyway, his version of narcissism is that, if when you are in pain, it's very difficult to think about anything other than your own suffering. And that's most obvious in terms of like physical pain. If you break your leg, you're not going to suddenly distract yourself and think about something else. It's very much that pain takes all of your attention. Psychic pain is very much the same. And I guess, but that psychic sort of pain isn't simply, contained within, the extremes of mental illness. It's a kind of pain that we all kind of go through in terms of just feeling ourselves out as social animals, where we sit in our own communities. So I guess, yeah, is this underside that can sort of say there's a narcissistic, that what we can call narcissism is also this sort of seeking a kind of collective joy, I think very much so. But it kind of takes a self-awareness in order to, navigate the other people that surround us. And the narcissism kind of, even as a pathology, contains that within it. It's far more than just a pathologized vanity. It can also be, like Freud talks about it in terms of being like in depression, where you are maybe wholly concerned with your own, feel bad about yourself. You can be narcissistic and not think you're great. You can be narcissistic and maybe just thinking overtly that you're shit, or paranoid in terms of, I guess the kind of delusion that the world is out to get you, very much focusing the world's attention on yourself, also a form of narcissism. So narcissism is kind of prevalent in all kinds of different mental illnesses in terms as far as Freud is concerned. But yeah, I think even more fundamentally, it's just a part of human experience. And thinking about it differently and not really shying away from our own self-concern of how it can benefit us, right? I mean, that self-concern can kind of come from a care for community. Am I doing all that I can to better those around me? That is a kind of maybe like is no less narcissistic, but it's I guess what's important about that is it's aimed outwards and it's aimed sort of more towards collective realization, which again, I guess that in itself is denounced now as a collective narcissism, but it's all nevertheless fundamental to a lot of social justice movements, past and present.
Thank you. Yeah, we'll go for it.
So I've got two things. I want to respond to Craig just very briefly to say, like, part of this has to be we still lack an ontology of the photograph that would be able to answer your question. I think in a certain sense, there have been people who have tried, like Sontag and Giorgio Agamben. They each try to give an ontology of the photo. Obviously, Walter Benjamin too, famously. Try to give an account, and Benjamin's a little less ontological, but it still participates in it. That it has to be the photograph in a certain sense isn't simply just like an image. It's not even just a representation, because it's between both a copy and reality itself. It's at one time a memory and the experience of a particular hope, right? The promise of an event that was captured and frozen in time. So it comes down to the very thing that Christian theologians, at least since Origin, have been worried about, right? Which is like, what is the relationship between the body and the glorious body, right? Between the idea of the body and its supposed, pre-discursive corporeality. But one of the things about this book that I obviously appreciate is that this book has an extensive engagement with the relationship between Hervé Guibert and Michel Foucault. Guibert is my favorite photographer, so like, cards on the table.
Mine too.
I love Hervé Guibert. So if you have the misfortune of reading anything, Guibert's work tends to be there on the page or the web page or what have you. And my question is, like, if the eluding of the present is kind of something that we have to flirt with when it comes to trajectories of subjectivation, right? Like, not just stepping into a handed down subject function or author function, right? But in fact, trying, like, showing the selfie as a kind of an account of the self that starts from pure potency and impossibility, right? Because the selfie is also, as Guibert will show, like an impossibility, right? The way you use Guibert is that his frustration is in fact the space of his breakthrough, right? And Guibert famously documents his own death in a kind of proto self photography sort of manner. So my question then ultimately is, what is, for you, if you could boil it down into just a quick answer, and of course you have to take into account the entirety of the Christian hermeneutic of the self, so good luck. First question is, what is the relationship between the process of subjectification as you're trying to articulate it here, and the process of taking the photograph, not just the photograph as an account of the self, but the liturgy of taking the photograph as an ethics. And then second, what is the relationship that you see? Why is death so important to the selfie, and why focus on Guibert and his death?
Yeah, I guess, I mean, yeah, fantastic questions, really. And it kind of ties into a lot of what was maybe the background for even writing that section of the book. I mean, photography was my undergrad degree. And I guess I sort of, it was mostly taking photographs, but there was this kind of theoretical component. We were told to sort of read the theoretical canon and the rest of it. And I hated most of it. I found it all super melancholic and depressing, with, yeah, death hanging over everything. But I guess in a way, I mean, that's certainly still true of my own book, but I guess it's an attempt to sort of what the sort of story of Narcissus, the kind of overtelling where he's transformed. Why that becomes so important, I think, is that it doesn't allow, or it suggests that, you know, photographic theory shouldn't stop there. So many books that try and produce an ontology of the photograph or a philosophy of photography kind of hit upon this sense of an inventory of mortality, as Sontag calls it, and it kind of stop there, and it becomes this super depressive kind of theoretical discourse, which is dumb, I think, because I guess it's what's the potential of I guess producing any kind of image. There was this huge, photography is now considered an art form. It's very, very recent. It was always kind of the black sheep of visual art until maybe about the 60s or 70s, or at least even, you know, like color photography. No one took color photography seriously until maybe like William Eggleston sort of really sort of pioneered and had his debut exhibition of color photographs. It was just saved for advertising, which again I think is quite telling. And I guess, excuse the plane overhead. I guess why Guibert is useful, or why I love Guibert in a way, is that he's no less kind of fixated on the sort of inherent sort of death drive of photography, if you can put it that way, but doesn't see it as an end in itself. That there is this sense in a lot of his work of a kind of, yeah, this something what there is it's not so much that photography captures and kind of reduces life, but actually that there's so much that photography cannot capture, and that's kind of where the beauty of it comes from, as a kind of like photography. And this is my favorite way about thinking of photography as a medium, as a kind of like explicitly visual poetry. You look at any kind of, if you're into your photo books, you kind of have this kind of fetishization of series of still images, but kind of like imagist poetry. Even it's sort of what's in between the images where a lot of the meaning and narrative comes from. And I think that's what Guibert kind of really, really leans into. I mean, not only is Guibert my favorite photographer, he's also my favorite writer on photography rather. It was a lecturer of mine at university who maybe somewhat significantly used to teach on a course that was called Photography for Fashion and Advertising. His name was Jason Evans, and he put me on to Guibert's book Ghost Image, which is a book about photography with no photographs in it at all. And I guess the primary sort of thrust of that book as a collection of essays is that each one kind of really considers the sort of limits of photography, experiences that cannot be photographed, or things that cannot be photographed sort of satisfactorily. But rather than see that as this kind of abject failure, there's this kind of there's a kind of joy to be taken from that, where again, like sort of written poetry, a lot of the beauty is kind of in the attempt. There's this great there was a preface that I wrote to the book that I ended up, it's on my blog now, xenogothic.com. I read it as a lecture in Dublin back in January. It ended up being cut from the book, but I kind of make this analogy between photography and poetry more explicit. And there's this great book on, in the UK at least, it was published by Fitzcarraldo Editions by a guy called Ben Lerner, called The Hatred of Poetry. And in there he talks about this this kind of the why everybody hates poetry so much. And it's kind of this sense of like, we all know the phrase, you're a poet and you didn't know it. That's kind of, I guess, he talks about how it's often applied to children that inadvertently say a sentence that rhymes. But as if there's this generalized understanding that everybody is capable of poetry. And that kind of makes being a professional poet all the more absurd. It's something that we're all kind of we're all capable of. And I think that's even more true these days of photography, where, it's just established itself as an art form that's taken seriously, at the same time as it's democratized quite radically, and now everybody has a camera in their pocket all the time. And as if there's this kind of cynicism towards photography, which comes from the fact that, we're all kind of capable of doing it. And so the idea of being a professional photographer then also equally becomes absurd. But I guess that what Lerner then takes from this kind of cynicism is that despite that, what's still so wonderful about poetry, and I would extend this to photography, is that it's every great poem is a failure, Lerner says, because it's kind of this attempt for the individual to dissolve themselves into some kind of collectivity or collective consciousness. You try and a poem can be so brief and so short, but then is so the whole attempt, I guess, is to sort of communicate something universal. And the sort of contradictions of that kind of abound from there. One thing that's quite significant, I think, is you look at copyright law about poetry. To reproduce poems as quotes in books is notoriously difficult because there's so much, despite that gesture to sort of, dissolve the individual into a collective consciousness. It's something that's all the more protected by copyright law, because poems, I guess, can be so short and sort of become just so easily immersed within collective consciousness. If you are an individual poet and you want to make money from the thing, you have to really defend that. And I think that in itself, as kind of maybe what seems like an unrelated aside, says a lot about the relationship between, I guess, self-representation, but even culture in general. And how, I guess, machinations of capitalism kind of pervert that fundamental gesture of dissolving the individual into the collective. And what is that if not a kind of death? That's, I guess, partly what I think Foucault is talking about when he's not talking about, Roland Barthes calls it the death of the author. Foucault twists it slightly and just calls it the author function. That's the very, the fundamental thing of becoming an author, is that you're no longer the self, the individual that writes. You become another kind of self that then is kind of more of a sort of collective social property, maybe, to put it sort of awkwardly.
Yeah, the poet Rene Char writes that you can never truly reread what you've written, but you can really just sign your name. Right, you can take on the author function, but you can never step into that position of writing again. And now this author function exists, and it won't die. Right?
Yeah, but I guess that's in a way that, I guess, to go back to this, may be a kind of convoluted answer to your question, but I guess that's kind of what I see, is that that is a kind of death of or it's not a death of the author, it's the death of the writer who becomes an author. And the kind of transformative nature of that, I think, is kind of wholly positive, and precisely because you can think of it as the individual being dissolved into a kind of collective consciousness. And that, again, is kind of going back to that thing of the individual or its dissolution being the first step onto the fostering of collective consciousness. It's something that seems so inherent to culture and cultural production, actually, and is something, therefore, to be kind of celebrated. But wrestling with that as yourself, either as someone who consumes culture or produces culture, it's such a strange thing to do, and such a strange kind of experience. But I guess it's something that we can see the positives in of what that can achieve, rather than kind of being just some sort of torturous thing that is just death and then nothing else. Obviously, we kind of know the death of the writer and the birth of the author is kind of what we love about so much culture. And what if that was applied more generally? What if we saw that kind of similar maneuver being in place within politics and social consciousness? And, you know, what if the selfie is kind of a more democratized version of jousting with that same kind of strange process? If we thought about it slightly differently, you know, who knows what could be possible in terms of, the social consciousness that could be produced to, change the world.
I wonder then if there's an additional question of, is there, insofar as this photographic element, this democratization of the production of images arrives on the scene, it leads me to wonder whether there's an inherent anti-authoritarianism to narcissism in the same way as an anti-author stance dissemination of photography. Because in a way, the pathologization of narcissism, the narcissist that conservatives say, well, not as conservative, some conservative lefts as well say, you're just being narcissistic, is never a self, which is the self which we're saying it's being narcissistic about. By that I mean, a sort of, I'm thinking particularly about the ways in which this term is used in relation to pain, as he was talking about, because there's a brilliant passage which it's from this small piece by Mark Fisher called "Good for Nothing," and which obviously, of course, you've written about before, but I just wanted to read it out for the listeners here. Writing about one's own depression is difficult. Depression is partly constituted by a sneering inner voice which accuses you of self-indulgence. You aren't depressed, you're just feeling sorry for yourself, pull yourself together, and this voice is liable to be triggered by going public about the condition. Of course, this voice isn't an inner voice at all. It is the internalized expression of actual social forces, some of which have a vested interest in denying any connection between depression and politics. And so what is often derided as narcissism, and I want you, I mean, you may disagree with this, I'd actually be interested to hear what you think about this. Essentially, narcissism being conflated with egoism. And is there actually an anti-authoritarian streak in being the individual? Because in affirming one's own individuality in the moment in which you say, I don't want this, I want to focus on myself, you're not really focusing on anything of much content. You're not focusing on an essence given to you, or you're not focusing on the role assigned to you by the social circumstances around you necessarily. I mean, when Marx and Engels were writing about Stirner, their criticism wasn't that he was narcissistic. It was that he didn't have the right proper methods to truly sort of achieve the communistic and sort of the insurrectionary aims he wanted to do. And thinking about collective narcissism, the charge of collective egoism was essential, absolutely essential, to the anti-Semitic propaganda written by the left Hegelians, Bruno Bauer, and even Hegel himself, who they end up defining Judaism as a kind of fundamentally egoistic religion, which might as well be said to be narcissistic insofar as it engages in a self-concern, which is to be morally disliked on the basis of concern for its own essence. Whereas actually, this is kind of the rejection of the self as essence. If you're engaging in this kind of narcissism that is writing, you're actually engaging in narcissism that it does not presuppose the sort of self that we usually talk about when we say individual. It's actually being about concern the fact that there's not actually anything. There's something wrong here. The narcissism is actually concerned about it rejects the authority around it, or rejects the sort of the encoding of the self. It says, I'm not this thing, or something about the thing that I have been made into is wrong, and I want to take care of that in a way which takes care of myself, but also changes what it means to be myself. So I apologize to listeners for the overuse of the word self there. This is how you get the entire history of German philosophy, and I'm telling you, it doesn't get even better with Hegel. Is there a kind of anti-authoritarianism to the narcissism you're talking about, insofar as it's tied to not only a death of the author, but also particularly in terms of the way in which these can be disseminated? And you talk a lot about virality and viruses in the book. What's the way in which you can go viral in a way? Does the authority die of its own ability to be mass disseminated, to be mass reinterpreted? And does that narcissism engage in that transformation?
I agree absolutely. And I guess that's there's a bit in the book, I guess, where I talk about that in terms of Roland Barthes' death of the author. But I guess what he's really talking about there is a kind of the renouncing of a kind of authorial agency. as if to say that, yeah, the author of a text doesn't have final say over its interpretations. And I guess that too, yeah, I sort of see that, that's within the realm of literary theory, but you broaden that outwards, and I think you absolutely have a kind of anti-authoritarian bent to things there. I mean, I'd have to reread it because it's already sort of fallen out of my head, but a major influence on this book was a couple of years ago proofreading Tom Wyman's sort of really creative edit, or I guess you call it that, of the German ideology by Marx and Engels, and then that kind of the way that he kind of jousts with that. And I guess we've talked before, Adam, about your own research in terms of Stirner. But even going back to like all of that stuff's kind of fallen out of my head, so I don't feel like I'm capable of saying much more on that angle specifically. But at least on the Mark Fisher stuff, which I will probably never lose at this point, it's become in my DNA now. I mean, that was the book in a way for me. The Narcissus in Bloom is kind of a sort of silent retort to some critiques of Egress, which I guess was a book that I wrote in between 2017 2019, following Mark Fisher's death at Goldsmiths, and how we responded as a community to that moment, challenging the kind of emergent narrative around Mark Fisher, and that his suicide cancelled out all of his political work, when really there was so much more in there. It is that kind of that tension where Fisher's kind of, to put it maybe sort of euphemistically, utter renouncement of his individual self negates all of his collective politics, which is just, again, dumb, I think. But yeah, precisely that question, that the section you were speaking about from Good for Nothing is sort of, that was so fundamental to Egress in a way. Like it was a book that was written in the first person about my own grief, if only because I didn't think I was in any position to comment on anybody else's. But the whole sort of impetus for that book was to start from, I guess, the personal and make it impersonal, to suggest that to fully sink into one's personal experience of grief, and then try and nonetheless produce a kind of collective politics out of that, was sort of deeply fraught and quite traumatic. But that was always the kind of fundamental intention: how to escape this kind of depressive individual, of a grieving individual that was myself at that time, and kind of reconnect with a sense of community that was so fundamental to Mark's work and the people that grieved around him. And yet, nevertheless, despite that, online, a few people called the book self-indulgent and narcissistic, and it was like, oh, you're completely missing the point. So how to have a go at addressing that by writing a book about narcissism in the third person, and ending, I guess, with a sort of, I guess the book ends with a sort of personal reflection that's very kind of implicit and really not that in depth, but hopefully has this kind of, it seems maybe to some as a complete left turn from the work that I've done on Mark Fisher. But if anything, Narcissus in Bloom is kind of the inverse image of Egress in my head. It's addressing a lot of the same concerns around the relationship between individual in pain and the community in pain, or individual joy and collective joy, and how those two things can become so blurred in terms of personal crises and grief. And I guess this book addresses those same things, but from afar, takes a huge step back and looks at them from a kind of art historical standpoint. Sort of, big picture, sort of cultural critique maybe, rather than that kind of more narrow view. But that section from Good for Nothing and Mark's writing on that in general is still a primary influence here. And I think, I guess basically to go back to that initial question of, is there an anti-authoritarian bent? I think absolutely, but it's such a knotted question, I suppose, at the same time. But those tensions, I guess, can still be productive. But it requires, I think, a different kind of thinking, or at least a challenging of how we pathologize and denounce certain kinds of individualism, or at least make individualism as its individualism and egoism, maybe the kind of the way that everything's kind of just lumped under one postmodern pathology. actually covers over a lot of potentials that have been there throughout, the history of radical politics since around the Renaissance onwards, and are no less, they're ripe for the picking today. But we just have to do away with that kind of reductive thinking about what narcissism really is, or what it contains, maybe.
Absolutely. Craig?
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry, Will, go for it.
Go for it, Will.
There's this fascinating moment where you're talking about like the history of the pathologization of narcissism, and I'm thinking about, because we run a Foucault reading group now on Madness and Civilization, and we just read the preface to that work. And in the preface, Foucault argues that there was no term contrary to the logos, but there was this one term, ebios, which translates to hubris. Callicles is hubristic, Thrasymachus is hubristic. And what's fascinating is not really until the 19th century would the classification of narcissism manifest. It would manifest primarily as hubris. It wouldn't be until Falleret, Freud, Charcot, et cetera, that that we would understand, we would come to understand narcissism as a pathological chronic tendency. But what's so interesting is there's this idea that, so my question is, we're constantly compelled to give an account of ourselves, right? Like even the people who laud themselves as, cyber hermits, right? Like even in their bit, if their bit is to post a certain way or to not be online at all, right? I'm thinking of Heidegger's comment where like the hermit is more dependent on society than anyone who's just walking around in it, because the hermit defines themselves negatively in relation to it, and thus gives themselves over to that relation in the non-relation. I'm thinking like, okay, so all of these other things, these are socially acceptable accounts of the self, right? My ID photo, my work report, my quarterly account, all of the various things that I do every single day. Even, when Mark Fisher gives that story of the teacher running through the various barricades at which they have to present their identification in this kind of biopolitical nightmare, each of those instances is an account of the self. My question is like, why is it that the second that frankly, the biomedical element, the capturing of the body, is toyed with in a way that is not directly in correspondence to the production of a particular population, then it becomes repersonalized and personalized as a problem? Like why, how is it that we can identify within our particular political milieu across the quote unquote left and right divide, like a particular utilization of information technology meant to capture us, once we start capturing ourselves for fun, once we start toying with these things, right? And I'm thinking of like accounts of BDSM, right, where power becomes a playful aspect. You talk about this with homosexual erotics in the 19th century, right? And of course, books like My Secret Life and so on, where power enters into a state of not reversibility necessarily, but playful rearticulation. Is there a relationship between like the history of toying with the machine of subjection and the selfie? Like, is there a way that we can see this as a kind of form of like getting lost in the weeds of the violence of the cyber scene, whatever you want to call it?
Yeah. I think maybe that's the part of the problem with narrative in the present, right? That we're sort of why you're looking at yourselves all the time. Yeah, you're just sort of feeding the machine. But I guess it's sort of like it becomes a bit of a chicken and egg scenario where, are we only looking and producing this data of ourselves because the machine's encouraging it, or is the machine latching onto this tendency that we have within ourselves? And I think I guess I personally think I'm more leaning towards the latter. And I guess that's partly why I go back so far in the book to like the Italian Renaissance. So I guess the first painting discussed in the book is Albrecht Dürer's, I guess like early 1500s painting. I can't remember the year now, but the famous one of where he looks like a Christ. And we look back on that image now and people kind of deride it as if he's got these delusions of grandeur. It's truly narcissistic. He thinks he's on a par with God. But then John Berger has this reading where it's like, no, you know, Dürer was a kind of committed Roman Catholic, and he's not rather saying I see myself as Christ, but I aspire through the suffering I know to be more like Christ, to take Christ on as an example, and literally transform his own appearance into looking more Christ-like as a kind of aspirational, you know, it's as if to sort of signify a kind of aspirational mode of living that's fundamentally Christian. And there's all kinds of, you know, different problems with that and readings of it. But I think that's partly, I think I kind of see that painting as kind of what you're talking about, as that way of tinkering with the self, visual representations of the self to kind of imagine either, I guess in Dürer's case, himself in another way. But I guess a lot of art and culture in general does that to imagine better worlds, even not just new selves, but new worlds is kind of something I think I draw on repeatedly in the book. And yeah, it's, well, I don't know, maybe I don't know if that answers your question as it is.
Well, maybe I can introduce something that will kind of create a dovetail between the notion that narcissism is inherently anti-authoritarian and in one sense is, well, it is the kind of force that's charged. There's a kind of force that's charged with being narcissistic, but which is always trying to create the new. As you might know, and those listening might know, we are soon going to start. And by the time this is heard, the first session will have already been recorded. We're doing a reading group on Nietzsche and philosophy. And it seems now Nietzsche and philosophy and the subject of Nietzsche is like a big figure in the discourse right now online. And I listened yesterday to Machinic Unconscious Happy Hours episode on the first 3 chapters. And one of the things that Taylor had brought up that I thought was quite interesting was that the idea of a becoming is at odds with the resentment of that which either fears becoming or hates becoming. In the sense, I mean, we can put this in pretty simple terms, you know, teenage rebellion or, you know, the gender movement, feminism, Black Lives Matter, all of that, in some sense, these are becomings that are attempting to disarticulate themselves from a dominant image. And the reaction of resentment on the side of those who seek these more stable vectors, I think, convert that resentment or even envy into the charge of narcissism. And on the other side, what we see is that movement of disarticulation engenders things like pain, suffering, and a concentration of one's either individual or collective psychic energy on the presence of that pain or the becoming itself, wherever it's taking us or me or whoever. And I think there's a feedback loop that occurs there, which makes social change quite problematic because you have these two forces that are just vehemently tugging on one another. And this idea of narcissism is, I mean, a social tool, a moral tool as a way to discredit these becomings. And so there's where I see the sort of nexus between the anti-authoritarian and the emergence of the new.
Yeah, I guess maybe going back to what Will was saying, like I guess they kind of come onto this towards the end of the book, of kind of looking at the sort of French 20th century French philosophy's kind of utter suspicion of the visual, of representation in general. And I guess there is this tendency if we're saying, well, you know, selfies are bad, they are just as feeding data into the machine. Or we're kind of becoming, narcissistically trapped within our own reflection sort of thing. And so maybe what is the solution then to just, disarticulate ourselves from certain kinds of self-representation, or even just self-representation as such, you know, just everyone log off and stop posting selfies and that will change anything. And I think that's not true, really. Talking about the Deleuze's Nietzsche and philosophy, my favorite line from that book, I think it's quite early on, But it's a line that I think applies to just about everything. I think I used it in a blog post about accelerationism a while ago, but we won't go into that mire. But Deleuze writes that the history of a thing in general is the succession of forces which take possession of it and the coexistence of the forces which struggle for possession. And I love that line as just a way of thinking about the history of philosophy, and I guess the history of political philosophy in general. And I guess in one way, the purpose of this book, in a way, is to try and provide, the history of a thing, that thing being the self or the individual. They're things that we kind of renounce and denounce all the time, but there is a history there of fighting for, what does he say? Like fighting for possession. And I guess that's the thing, we see that selfies as being something that is immediately possessed by power. But I guess there's a bit in the second part of the book, or the third part, depending on how you look at it, on photography, of talking about the notions of power in French philosophy in particular, and kind of suggesting these two versions of power, which English often translates as like power with a small case p, power with the uppercase p, as instead being like potential and possession. What is within your own power, and in what way is power enacted upon you? And I guess at the crux of that is still this notion of self, of agency and control. And I think, that's kind of something to be made all the more, we should be made all the more aware of in terms of our own, self-representation in the age of social media. It can go either way, and to sort of abdicate self-representation entirely, I don't think is a way to sort of win the war. It's kind of to just give up on relation or on certain technological conceptions of self, as a kind of like I don't know, anarcho-primitive egoism maybe, or something. I don't know. But we should, we can't, because I don't know, we do get, I guess it's the point to say that we do get so much joy out of sharing our lives with others. That is kind of the fundamental joy of social media. The shite of social media kind of outweighs that joy a lot of the time. But that, I think, is something that, it can't really be forgotten about why we sort of were interested in this kind of new medium of self-expression in the first place. And I guess, that kind of going back to that same thing of, it's not that maybe the point isn't so much that we are just representing ourselves as individuals and that's it. I guess there is this sense that on social media, and I mean, I guess going back to like Mark Fisher, and I guess even further back to like the CCRU, this kind of use of pseudonyms and even later on of like blogonyms and the rest of it was kind of that same thing of using these new technologies, in the internet specifically, as a way to dissolve the self that you are into a kind of wider milieu. And find, the radical political potentials that kind of lie within doing that. It appears much and more harder to do that, but it's not something to be given up on, I don't think. And I think that's true of a lot of the sort of projects that are kind of going on even now in kind of the theory sphere. The blogs that do still exist, where I don't know, there are tensions there, and maybe we could talk about that because it would be too much of an aside right now. But that there is a kind of becoming Narcissus, to be sure. Because I mean, I guess that's the thing, right? It's retaining that transformative element that is at the heart of the original Narcissus tale. We are not going to drown in our own self-reflections because Narcissus didn't.
And I think that's precisely it. The idea of that you brought in by Deleuze there, that this notion that we are possessed by these certain powers. There's almost a sort of thin line, a precarious line that we walk when we embrace these new becomings. On the one side, we could say is capture the sort of existing logos of things as they are, and on the other side is either rapture or captivation. And what we get, I think we forget with the looking at Caravaggio's image of Narcissus here, I think particularly brings this out is that what Narcissus is undergoing is an aesthetic experience. It's an experience of beauty. And we forget that amidst the guilt that is circulated by the charge of narcissism, that there's an aesthetics that's lost. And it's in that aesthetics where the transformation occurs.
Yeah, totally. And I think I sort of talk about this in the book a bit too, where, I mean, there's a really great book that I loved reading whilst writing this one, which was Susanna Berger's The Art of Philosophy. And she talks a bit about how visual art prefigures a lot of philosophical concepts. And there's a later essay where she kind of focuses specifically on Caravaggio's Narcissus and these ideas of something like a meta image, an image like Caravaggio's Narcissus that kind of dramatizes the very experience of seeing, that precisely that aesthetic experience that you're talking about. But I guess part of the sort of implicit argument of the book in the way is that, without selfies, without the self-portrait, we wouldn't really have a lot of the philosophy that came afterwards. I mean, for better and for worse. Like, you arguably wouldn't have Cartesianism, you also wouldn't have liberalism, maybe, which would be preferable. But it's a lot of sort of modern, in the broadest sense, philosophy kind of just emerges from this moment of like, Renaissance self-awareness and new representations of the self. And yeah, maybe sort of like throwing that away is kind of more impossible than just like moving through it. That transformative sense of like the only way out is through the self. And again, I think that's kind of like, I mean, that's in terms of the sort of pathologizing of narcissism. I mean, I guess that's the point of psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis doesn't see narcissism as a dead end, at least generally speaking. The kind of task is of the psychoanalyst with the analysand is that, if someone has narcissistic tendencies, their ego is kind of trapped within the ego. You need sort of communication with someone else to draw yourself out of that again. But then, what is the sort of therapeutic experience if not innately narcissistic? It's like, here's a space for you to sit in front of me and tell me about all of your problems, to really focus in and dive deep and pull, but then, to pull yourself out of them. And, a bit of a anti-psychiatrist bent in general, as if to say that, that's not a fundamental way of doing things. But I think that kind of initial intention is nonetheless a positive one. And I guess it's precisely that tension that is within the narcissist myth. That no man is an island kind of vibe. There's the even, I guess, what Will was saying about the hermits as kind of being the person most dependent on the system that they are escaping from. I guess I sort of see that kind of reminded me when Will was saying that of what you were saying, Craig, of before, of like, being very much offline. It's kind of that thing where, to not appear, kind of, you depend on the system of appearing that you are kind of renouncing, right? So if there's kind of no escape from these tensions, then all the more reason to kind of see what the process of narcissism itself is, precisely as a becoming, not as a stasis, but as a way to maybe see the image before you that you don't like, to kind of have reflected back at you the things that you don't like about yourself, or more generally in this kind of collective narcissism vibe, to see as a group of people the sort of image that society projects of you that you don't like, and to sort of riotously push against it. I guess I can talk about this in the introduction to the book, and I guess I talked about it earlier too, but that's sort of why Black Lives Matter is a kind of prime example of this for me. And I guess in writing the book, I was kind of warned against this as it being a sort of sensitive area. But what is Black Lives Matter if not the kind of ultimate version of that, this contemporary narcissistic dilemma? You have Black communities that are confronted by images of themselves being brutalized in the media all of the time, and not being able to escape that image and the sort of the projections that whiteness puts upon Black communities. What are you to do if not to riotously lash out against those and try and and to change them? And I think it's always significant that when riots do occur in terms of, in the sort of various unjust fallouts of police brutality. When riots happen, they are denounced as self-harm. But, such was the fate of Narcissus too, whose own self-harm produced a radical kind of transformation. And it's a contentious thing to say that, Black Lives Matter is inherently narcissistic, but it's that provocation that I think a lot of the book rests on. And there are kind of other sort of examples of this, like Frantz Fanon in Black Skin, White Masks gives this sort of psychoanalytic account of the Black experience in precisely those terms of seizing the narcissism that he knows, and aiming it towards something else, which is the complete transformation of the Black community and of the Black experience in general. And I mean, I guess that's partly what is sort of was so strange in even writing this book in a way. Like, that's kind of a pretty well-known text, I think, and there are others that I reference in the book. But this jousting with narcissism in these explicit terms is often overlooked, and it never quite penetrates this normative understanding that we have. But it's there, and there's so many examples of other people that have written this stuff, and it just doesn't seem to have sort of kind of been embedded in our collective consciousness as I think it usefully could be.
It's very interesting to think about the distance of the inability to thus recognize narcissism in sort of key texts, or at least as a term, because of the fundamentally, the way in which such writing is taught. It's taught to be distant or objective. Now, I love the term objective, writing objectively, because objects, they just, every journalist is now Graham Harman or something, There are no subjects, there are only objects, and therefore to be objective is therefore to be practically absolute or noumenal, and so anything else is just narcissistic. And this shows really in a way in which people, especially not only the Black struggle, but also this queer struggle, of course, there are intersections, obviously, between the images put out for them in the press. I mean, it becomes sort of a battle between almost the self which mediation tells you is yours, and the self that you can be as yourself. It's becoming who you, to put for it in Nietzsche's phrase, it's either Nietzsche or Nirvana. You come as you are, overdetermined by social relations, or you become who you are. And on that note, Maddie, where can people find you? I know there's a couple of course you got the blog, but also I think there's a couple of launch events for this. I know we just had one go past, but I think there's one more, maybe two upcoming.
There's one upcoming. Yeah, I had those two launch events a week or two ago in London, Newcastle. There's going to be another one in London at Hoxton Books, 6 p.m. on the 20th of September. So yeah, if you are around, come down for that. I'll be doing a reading and a Q&A, and then getting pissed again. And yeah, you can find me on xenogothic.com or at xenogothic on most of the social media platforms that we are tormented by.
Come down and look at your own reflection from the surface of a pint. It's a great experience, I'll tell you. All right, everyone, this has been Acid to Rise of a Zero Repeater, and we will catch you all later. Cheers for listening.
We appreciate your support of the imprint and the channel. Subscribe to Zero Books Today on Patreon. Your material support helps us to promote a variety of perspectives on the left. Also, discover the many titles, new and old, that Zero has curated. Navigate to any of the links in the show notes to extend your support.